Hello, everyone. Welcome back once again to Mongabay's webinar series for journalists, broadcast to you live from YouTube and also LinkedIn. I am your host and moderator, Mike DiGirolamo. As I always encourage you to do, please subscribe to Mongabay's YouTube channel so you can be notified when this webinar is edited after we're done here today, and also be notified when our next one is planned. So today's webinar topic is focused on the ever-evolving field of conservation technology. And we're going to be looking at some of the latest trends, strengths, and limitations of this modern tech, and critical questions journalists should consider when working on a story. Before I introduce our panel, I always like to remind you that if you want to stay on top of opportunities and job openings at Mongabay, we encourage you to sign up for our email newsletter, which you can find on the opportunities page at mongabay.org. And of course, we're always seeking your pitches. So if you have a story idea after viewing today's discussion, please send us your idea via the subject heading Special Reporting Projects, also on the opportunities page at mongabay.org. However, we also encourage you to pitch your story idea to other outlets, if not to us. If you've tuned into past webinars, you're probably familiar with the format that we do, but for those who are not familiar, we will give each panelist an opportunity to answer a slate of roughly 10 questions that I moderate, and that at the conclusion of that hour-long session, we open up the floor to your questions in a roughly 15-minute Q&A. We may go a little past the hour depending on how much we get through. So without further ado, I want to introduce our panel. Dr. Meredith Palmer is our first panelist, and her work centers on large-scale camera trapping, citizen science, machine learning, AI, and other hardware and software conservation technology tools. Specifically, she strives to bridge technology, computer science, and conservation sectors to innovate new techniques for collecting and processing ecological data. Currently, she heads the conservation technology team at the international wildlife NGO Fauna and Flora International. Meredith, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, no, thank you for this opportunity. I'm really excited by the great panel you've drawn together, and I think we've got some really fun things to chat through today.
And next, I'd like to introduce Mongabay staff writer Abhishyant Kidangoor. Abhi is also a video producer, and since 2014, he has covered a wide range of stories on climate change, health, and human rights from around the world. Before joining Mongabay, he worked with Time Magazine and CNN News 18. Previously a Sue Palmentary Wild Tech Fellow with Mongabay, he is now a full-time staff writer focusing on the intersection of technology with a multitude of environmental issues. Thank you so much for joining us today, Abhi. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Mike. Excited to be here as well.
And also joining us is Shah Selbe. Shah is the founder of Conservify and a National Geographic Explorer and Fellow. He is an engineer and conservation technologist that works with communities, NGOs, and developing nations to identify and deploy technologies to help with their conservation challenges. Conservify has built open source hardware for use in the field on National Geographic expeditions and through a network of scientists and conservationists known as FieldKit. Shah, thank you for being here today.
Hey, I'm very glad to be here and love talking about this stuff, especially with these great panelists. So thank you.
And of course, once again, I'm your host and moderator, Mike DiGirolamo, the Audience Engagement Associate for Mongabay. Just to reiterate, I'm going to give each panelist an opportunity to answer each question, and then at the end of the hour-long session, we'll hold a 15-minute Q&A for your questions. If you do have a question and you think of it while we're talking, just go ahead and drop it in the chat box on the platform you're tuning in on today, whether that's LinkedIn or YouTube, and we'll address that at the end of the hour. Just a reminder, you will be able to view this entire webinar on demand on our YouTube channel, actually immediately following this broadcast. But within 48 hours, I will edit the broadcast with timestamps and resources that we are sharing here today. So make sure if you want to view it again, check back and use those timestamps for easy navigation. Also, if you registered, you'll be receiving a publication notice directly to your inbox along with a brief survey, which we really would like for you to fill out. We will also publish a link to this on the blog on mongabay.org. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so for some context, I just want to give you all a little bit of context, as of 2022, scientists estimated that at the current rate of exploration, it could take as long as 300 years to describe the remaining undocumented species on the planet. That's a lot. We talked about this quite a bit at Mongabay and the implications this has for biodiversity protection. So conservation technology obviously plays a really significant role in helping scientists and conservationists identify species. So can you talk about some of the most important ways that conservation technology is helping scientists achieve this? And also, what are some of the biggest advances in the field in general that journalists should be aware of?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll start. I think, one of the biggest benefits behind conservation technology, obviously, is giving us the ability to better kind of measure and quantify the way the planet is changing. This matters when we talk about extinctions. It matters when we talk about climate change or disappearing habitats, things like that. And also like, humanity's impact on nature, human-wildlife conflict, those sorts of things, right? The things that I get really excited about, and, I'm very excited to hear what the other panelists think, is the main one that I focus on is hardware and like the ability for us to miniaturize and kind of weatherize electronics to get data out in the field. So that's things like sensors, environmental sensors measuring how, the environment's changing over time, giving us more real-time data. There's camera traps, GPS tags, all this tech that really is just helping scientists, conservationists, and governments understand what's out there, how it's changing, what humans are doing to make that change. The two other things I'll quickly mention, but I won't go too much into, is I think there's an increasing role of things like AI and machine learning in conservation technology, particularly how we kind of understand and process acoustic and visual data. And then there's a big push right now around DNA-based technology. So things like environmental DNA and how do we understand what's there using kind of more real-time systems than have ever been possible before there.
Yeah, 100%. I think as someone who works for a wildlife conservation NGO, when I think about conservation technology and the role it plays in the work that we do, as Shah said, it enables us to collect more and better data. So where it's improving the scale of data collection on spatial and temporal scales, we can survey more of the world, and we can do it more frequently. And that impacts our ability to adapt in closer to real time. It improves the quality of our management insights and our ability to respond to these, as Shah's been saying, rapid changes that are coming in our world. There's the hardware element. The software element too, I think, is really important because we have these tools, the camera traps, the acoustic monitors, the eDNA, satellites, drones, that are improving the scale of our data collection. But then that data is locked away. There's a processing step, there's a data management step, there's a data visualization and learning and reflection step that conservation technologies like AI and data management tools help us get better insights into that data. We can ask more meaningful questions, new questions, interesting questions with the more powerful analytics and reporting we have with that as well. So yeah, I think as Shah said, monitoring systems is really key with conservation technology. Our ability to respond and adapt to what we detect, the changes we detect in systems, is also faster using some of these new emerging tech tools like AI. And I also want to throw out some fun ones, some of the tech that we can use for behavior change as well, and for those things that are sort of above and beyond just looking at wildlife and looking at habitats. I think the growth of citizen science and apps like iNaturalist, they allow regular people, non-scientists, to connect with the natural world and feedback data to people, conservationists who are trying to understand it. I think there's some really fun advances in games and gamification and augmented reality that, again, sort of bring people into the natural world and help them better understand the conservation challenges that we're facing. And then even like, if you want to go way out there, there's blockchain and different kinds of technologies that help us verify that products are being sourced from environmentally friendly, like agriculture being harvested in environmentally friendly ways. So I think just the scope of conservation technology is so broad and so exciting, and there's many different facets to how we're applying it into the work we're doing for people and for wildlife.
And just to add to what Shah and Meredith said, I have this ringside view of what is happening as a journalist, and it's AI all the way, right? And at least in the past 12 to 15 months, regardless of how the data has been collected, be it drones, be it DNA sampling on the field, or be it audio data, it's all being channeled and funneled through AI models and algorithms to deduce conclusions from it. So I think that's definitely something we as journalists should keep in mind, because it's evolving very rapidly, and something to keep in mind as we think of stories, because it's been part of every story that I've been doing for the past 6 months, essentially. One of the other changes that I've also seen again in the past 12 to 15 months is when I started reporting on this, there was a lot of talk of how all the different technology is like siloed. There are people working in drones working separately from people who are working bioacoustics, for instance. But slowly, very slowly, maybe not as fast as required, but very slowly, there's a confluence to sort of get a holistic understanding, a more comprehensive understanding of ecosystems as well. So how these technologies sort of interacting with each other is also something I think that's advancing and we need to keep an eye on.
Yeah, just if I add one more thing, I think what Meredith and Abhi said was fantastic, and it really where we are when it comes to conservation technology is we're in a place where the development of technology has become so accessible and easy for people that you can have someone in their garage write an app that really ends up impacting a lot of the way that people understand these sorts of things. So conservation and field science largely for the longest time were kind of stuck with using what technologies were out there, and they were stuck with using kind of maybe technologies that were developed in the context where things like usability and affordability and all this sort of stuff were not part of the design process, and as a result it became very expensive and inaccessible for people to use these things. Well, now we're in this place where there's people all over the world that are passionate about an idea, and they're building things in their kitchens, in their backyards, in their garages, that can actually make a huge difference here. And it's exciting to be able to kind of identify those sorts of solutions and show that the tool maker now has become anybody out there that's passionate about an idea, and it's no longer kind of proprietary companies and universities and stuff that are guiding the development a lot of these technologies.
Can I follow up on that? I'm sorry. This is what excites me the most, is the men in the shed, Shah, developing their new tools. I come from an ecology background. I come from a conservation background. And when I started in this field 10 plus years ago, you can see the potential of this technology. The commercial tech is sitting there. It's in your phones. It's on the shelves. It's in these great tools that they're not built for us, for wildlife ecologists. They don't work how we need them to or where we need them to. They don't survive the gauntlet that we run them through in the field. And it's these amazing collaborations and this increased accessibility of these tools with collaborations with people like Shah, like what you do is starting to empower us as conservationists to go out there and say, okay, we need a tool that does this and meets these specs and survives in these low resource conditions. And we're starting to have tech that is being built for and works for us, which is amazing.
So, with all the advancements that there are, what are some of the most important environmental context to consider? So, like things like the sixth mass extinction or global biodiversity loss or climate change, and how should we introduce these things to the reader or remind the reader of these things when working on a story?
I can go there. So I think with climate change and biodiversity loss, you being more and more out in the mainstream media, I think there's an understanding of what that is. But I think with regard to biodiversity, people, when I write my stories, for instance, there's not a lot of understanding of biodiversity COPs, for instance. People know what climate COP is. They know what COP28 is, but they don't necessarily know what COP15 is, or, they need some reminding of what that is, for instance. Also terms like the Global Biodiversity Framework, what does it state? What are its goals? And where are we? Are we on track to achieve the goals? So I think those are things that we need to explain a little bit more and contextualize and give history to than I think climate change or biodiversity loss, which are terms which are like, for good or for bad, are out there already. But yeah, I would love to hear what Shah and Meredith have to say about this.
Can I follow up on that? Because that was also something I had flagged to talk about here, is that I think we're increasingly seeing businesses and governments get in on this conservation space. And so we have a lot of these terms, the COPs, the Paris Climate Accords, 30 by 30, TNFD, like acronyms everywhere. And it's hard enough for me to keep track of all of these new regulations, which are encouraging the people with power and money, to pay attention to biodiversity and increasing their interest in monitoring and protecting biodiversity. I think that there's an interesting history of monitoring carbon and commercializing carbon credits that is worth reflecting on, especially as we go into biodiversity credits, a whole new world of trying to capture and understand and quantify biodiversity, which may not, it's hard to really capture the value of some of these biodiversity, the value of nature in different ways. Like, how do you put a number on that? So I think there's a lot of digging and understanding that needs to be done in that space as well.
Yeah, and I might answer this question in slightly a different way. Is that I'm a conservationist, but by training I'm an engineer. So I consider myself a tool maker, right? So the research that I work has always been focused on partnering with people who are out there actually doing this incredibly difficult work on the ground. And there's some things that I've learned I think context that I've learned from a technology standpoint that might be useful for folks who are looking at this sort of thing. So a couple of those things. One is like with Conservify and fieldkit.org, we really focus on openness, because I think being open around like the development of the technology, the availability of the data, the access to the tech, all that sort of stuff is important for like a function to allow other people to be able to use these tools and not kind of limit it in certain areas. So there's a couple things I think about when it comes to just the tech side of things that I think are important for context. One is accessibility to the technology. So this is things like, who's it made for? Who does it support? What's kind of the cost, not only initial cost, but life cycle cost? And like, how do you support that tech through the life cycle? I think it's really important to talk about data ownership and data access. And so, where does the data go? Who can see it? What is it used for? Who owns it? How can this data actually help the conservation goals that we have? One thing that I harp on all the time is when you create these tools, like there needs to be usability around them. So we don't think about this ever, because a lot of the stuff that we use, like our smartphones and consumer technologies, have so much thought put into usability. But when you get to scientific tools and conservation technologies, that typically doesn't happen, just because they don't have the budget necessarily to do that. But like being able to make these things usable is really important to a lot of projects, particularly in the Pacific South. And the last thing I would say is just from a purely technical level, like a lot of times this is a very engineering sort of term, but people like to talk about technologies under like a technology readiness level, TRL. So you'll hear people say, oh, what's the TRL of this? This is a term that organizations like NASA use very extensively to discuss what they're working on. And it basically is a scale from like 1 to 9 that says, like, is this thing a pipe dream, or is it a prototype, or is it something that's like really honestly something that that anybody can use. And so that's a mechanism to kind of think through the maturity of a technology and whether or not it makes sense in that space.
Oh, I have two things I want to jump on there that I think are really important. And maybe we're going to get to this in a little bit, but thinking about technology readiness and journalism in particular, and how tech is pitched and highlighted in the media, is thinking about the technology hype cycle, where we get these techs which again like might work really, really well in commercial realms, but aren't ready to be deployed in the field or in conservation spaces. And there's a graph of the tech hype cycle where you start off with a technology trigger that gets everyone really, really excited about the possibilities of some new emerging technology, and it's going to completely change how we do conservation. You go up the peak of inflated expectations, and then it's not ready to work in the field. It doesn't work for us. It creates new problems. There's unintended consequences. People haven't thought through the whole process, the whole life cycle of that tech as part of a conservation solution. Then you go down into the trough of disillusionment, and people get really, conservationists, we get burned out on these new techs that keep coming across our radars, and everyone keeps selling them to us as being so exciting and game-changing, and they just don't work for us. And then like people come to terms with how the tech works, with its fallibilities and how it actually functions in the field. We partner with people who help adapt it for our needs, and we actually, eventually for many technologies get to a place where we can use those in the field. But I think this hype around technology and actually, checking in as a journalist with people in the field to get an understanding of whether this tech is actually ready to be deployed and make an impact before selling everyone on what a game changer it's going to be is really key. And another contextual concern, Shah was talking about accessibility of tech. And I think, and I'm not an expert in this, but I do a lot of thinking around how tech can broaden divides between developed and developing countries, between the global north and the global south. I believe there's a term, has anyone else heard the term smart forest, where you can throw all these sensors and technologies into monitoring patches of rainforest that are too expensive, where the tech literacy is too high, where the people surrounding that forest, there's no way for them to access that data and that information. And so being sure as part of talking about tech and how it's used is making sure that it is accessible, and that we work towards that. Part of deploying conservation technology is sort of leveling that playing field of accessibility and making sure that they're not just shiny, expensive, flashy new tools that only people from developed countries can access.
Those are great points, Meredith. Abhi, did you have anything to add?
No. So I just, again, from the jargon point of view, I think to contextualize things, since we are talking about technology, I think a lot of the times I do get emails about, hey, I wish this was explained more. For instance, CNN, convolutional neural network. So I think those are things that could, we could give more context on what is that, what is deep learning, for instance, what is hyperspectral imagery, for instance, or why is this satellite resolution better than this one. So these are things I think we as journalists could keep in mind and explain a little bit more, because that makes it more interesting. Otherwise, people just lose interest in the stories and just move on to the next click. So yeah, just wanted to add that as well.
And on that note, before we move on to the next question, I had a kind of a follow-up, maybe second half to this contextualized question, which was the technology itself. And we've talked about the accessibility of it, but what about explaining what it is to the audience? Like, for instance, machine learning. When we say machine learning, that may not be readily apparent to everyone what that is. So does the panel have any suggestions for journalists on how to explain or summarize some of the maybe the lesser explained technological terms?
I can, I think a lot of the concepts around like the basic principles around science communications can be very helpful here. One benefit that I found with I talked to a lot of people about conservation technology and students and like all sorts of, regular folk that aren't in the field of conservation. And I find that like, this is something from when I started doing this, like, 16 years ago or whatever till now, like it's become very easy, right? Because tech is a part of everybody's life, right? I mean, pretty much everyone on the planet is dealing with things like apps and smartphones and stuff. And it allows people to just kind of grasp things a little bit easier. Like I'm not a journalist, but in my just kind of experience in dealing with folks is these sort of basic concepts. As long as I don't get too technical, I don't get into kind of the deep part of the tech, and I describe it more conceptually, I feel like folks get it a lot faster than they used to get it. So I think that's great. And I also think conservation technology is something that lends itself to like visuals pretty well, right? Photos, videos, diagrams, things like that, just because you don't have to get into like the schematics of the technology or the code base or any of that sort of stuff, but just high level, what is it doing and how's it solving the problem? I think people understand that pretty well.
Yeah, I do feel like the public consciousness, speaking about AI and algorithms, zooming in on that, there's been so much in the news lately people might even know what a large language model is because of ChatGPT. But I think with that increased public consciousness, there's maybe increased public fear. I don't know. I find that when I'm trying to explain these concepts as well, if it can be done at a conceptual level without going into those, like grinding into those nitty gritty details of code, stepping through the process of how the tech is developed. So with AI, how does AI learn? How is it trained? What is the amount of human effort and oversight that goes into developing an AI? I think how fallible AI is, and talking about the challenges we have with tech too is really important. When I talk to people about the use of AI in conservation, they think it's solving all my problems and that I hit go on a computer and I walk away and I come back the next day and conservation solved. But there's so much more QC and effort. I don't, I go through and double check the data. It helps. It's a tool, not a solution. And when explaining these different advancements, taking the time to kind of step through how things are built and also explore where the challenges are is worth doing, because it gives people a fuller, more holistic idea of what the tech is actually capable of and where it does lend itself to helping us overcome these challenges.
Sorry, this is such an important point that Meredith is making. It's really, really important. I think so much, like people think that these tools are going to solve everything, right? And it happens with every single technology that comes out. I don't know, 7-8 years ago it was drones. Now it's AI. There's all these things that come out, and there's this expectation by everyone involved. I mean, the users on the ground, the general public, like the developers, that these tools are going to solve everything, and they absolutely never do, right? And like understanding that, the scope, and like framing it in a way that everybody is on the same page is so important, because there have been a lot of very good and I think like good-natured, positive, ambitious projects out there that have ruined a technology or, failed in a miserable way because of this expectation not equaling reality. It's such a critical part, because like when we're the people we're dealing with, conservationists and kind of folks in the field, they're not rich, right? They have like a very like finite set of resources, typically given to them by a donor or government. And like if you're spending a ton of money on something that is just not going to do what they expect it to do, that like leaves everyone involved with a bad taste in their mouth. It's like it's a bad thing for everyone. So I think this is such an important point that Meredith just said.
On that note, I'm going to go ahead and kick us over to the next question, because what you both just said is a really good segue into this, because my next question deals with what are some of the most reliable or perhaps underhyped applications of conservation technology that journalists could highlight more. So the example that I heard you say, Shah, one time on a talk you gave, you said that sometimes the best solution isn't like a highly technological one. It might just be someone with a pair of binoculars. And I thought that was a really interesting insight. And so I was going to ask the panel here if you had any more instances like this that you think that journalists really should talk about more.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk a little bit about that before we hear from the other panelists. But yeah, I mean, I think this is really important to think through, right? Their tech is generally considered cool, right? And so people get excited about things like drones and, you know, other sort of tech. When I go in different parts of the world and I put a drone up in the air, like everyone comes around and they want to watch it. But like, it's important to think about like what the need actually is, and make sure that you're building something or using something that's actually going to fill that need. So the story that you mentioned was, I was doing some work in an island in the Caribbean where they were trying to monitor illegal fishing that was happening around the island, and I was creating a framework around technology that could be used for monitoring and enforcement and all sorts of stuff. And one of the areas that they took me to was up on this cliff, and they showed me that the illegal fishing happens, you know, within 1 to 2 miles off the coast of this cliff, and they really wanted to use a drone for that problem. But like, the issue with the drone was there's no electricity in that area, you know, charging batteries and doing this stuff. It's not going to be up in the air for long enough to really make a big difference. In that situation, it made more sense to, like, you know, put a chair and a case of beer and give a guy a pair of binoculars and have him monitor it, instead of actually building a technology solution for that. So one thing I always say is I think conservation technologies are, I mean, they're very like specific to the problem itself and the area that it's being worked on, right? There's cultural issues around certain technologies. There's, you know, physical, technical issues around using certain technologies. So usually when we do something, we partner with an organization, we go out there and we understand, you know, who the users are, what the area looks like, what are the constraints in certain places, you know, look at, before we even start looking at possibilities. And then at that point, we end up designing a solution that might work for that organization or those people out there. But all that really needs to happen before, so you're not just throwing something over the fence and expecting them to, like, you know, solve rhino poaching with it, which is not going to happen.
Yeah, I think, you know,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Abhi.
No, I was just going to add, from a journalistic point of view as well, I saw myself falling into this trap when I started covering this, where only the cutting edge, sort of sexy technology was fascinating me. And then you come to a point that you realize that this cutting edge technology doesn't happen as often as you want to, especially not to match your publishing cadence, right? So that's when you start looking for other stories, and you come to realize that, you know, I think now drone is not considered high tech, I don't know, but maybe flying a drone to find nesting turtles, or walking around listening with a receiver, or the good old camera traps is still doing the trick. And oftentimes those are the stories, when you write them, there's more heart and there's more community to it as well. So yeah, that's definitely a trap, Mike, that journalists should not fall into, just looking for the high tech, sexy technology, to call it.
Yeah, I'm so sorry, but I'm really going to bring it down as someone who again works with a wildlife NGO. And when I think about the tech that we use at my organization, which has the greatest impact in the projects we have on the ground, it's things like radios, it's things like solar panels, it's electric fences, it's data collection apps, it's, you know, using Kobo Toolbox, which is a form for filling out data rather than just writing it down in your notebook. It really is, it's data management, it's pipelines that make it easier for us to get data from the field to like the point where it can be analyzed, which isn't really sexy, but the number of our projects that use drones or LiDAR or edge embedded AI is minuscule compared to the real scope of the technology that we're using. is simple, accessible, free solutions that unlock the ability for us to, again, collect more data better and analyze it. And I wanted to follow up on one thing that Shah said too about sometimes you don't need tech. And I think that's something I spent a lot of time thinking about too. If I have, as a poor conservationist, Shah, without me funding, if I have my $10,000 budget, do I buy 10 camera traps, or do I hire a local field assistant and fund his entire annual salary and have him rely on his local and indigenous knowledge to collect exactly the same data that I could have gotten from a camera trap? So I think we're going to get to it, but I think there's some ethical considerations about using fancy, shiny, high tech versus these more sort of simple, accessible, but highly impactful solutions that are less sexy.
We are going to get to ethical considerations, but first I want to talk about. I suppose this could be one of them. We're going to talk about limitations of tech. What are some of the biggest limitations to conservation technology at the moment that you think journalists should be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to come to this. I'm a hardware person. I like building like physical electronics and hardware that people can use in the field. So I'm going to come to this from that standpoint. And I think, the limitations that we see there are similar limitations that you see generally in electronics. One is, the biggest one is batteries. They're just, not powerful enough to allow people to do the things that they need to do. Conservationists are going out to these places that are incredibly remote. They're just these amazing places, but like the putting tech out in those fields, or like flying a drone for a certain amount of time, like there's always a need for that to be operating for a longer period of time. I mean, I've worked with folks, I'm sure Meredith knows this very well, who have big camera trapping programs, and they're literally just changing batteries and SD cards all the time. That's like the only thing the program is doing, is just swapping these things out because batteries are such an issue there. The second thing I would say is communications. And so that is just, what I mean by communications is kind of like the networks and the hardwares that allows us to bring the data back to the user. And so cellular, satellite, LoRaWAN, all these technologies that allow you to kind of bring back data real time, like they're incredibly useful because particularly if you're looking at like anti-poaching applications or human wildlife conflict, because it allows you to kind of react in a quicker sort of a way. But these systems they're big and they're expensive and complicated and power hungry, and they just don't really work the way I think that a lot of folks would like them to work to get that sort of data back real time.
I'm going to approach this from a practitioner perspective. So I think, Shah, you hit on the big ones, right? Like ruggedness and funding, and it has to work in the field. But speaking from my own experiences, we have to be able to use it and understand it. I can't tell you how many times, computer scientists have come to me and they want to partner to create the AI that's going to make it so we can go through, a decade's worth of camera trap data in 5 minutes. And they work out something really super fancy on their super fancy supercomputer using TensorFlow and Python, and they come up with an algorithm, and they've advanced AI in some amazing new way, and they publish a paper, and like poof, they're gone. And I have an algorithm that sits on a supercomputer in another country that I don't know how to use it. Like, okay, so like the so what step. So I think, a lot of the place where I've really focused over the last couple of years is trying to not just upskill conservationists in technology, but also bring technologists out into the field and help them understand, you're working with ecologists, you're working with local communities and local people, you're working with people who haven't gone to high school, might be your field assistant running your monitoring program, someone who, has never used a computer before, and they are, like the Windows 95 in their office is as fancy a computer as you're going to get. Your, Python script running on a supercomputer that requires internet and connectivity and a level of technical understanding is an amazing advancement for science, but it's not going to work for us. And it's been really heartening in the last couple of years, really getting that recognition and seeing people do a lot of work developing GUIs and wrapping their algorithms in software and really thinking about issues of like language barriers and literacy barriers, technical or otherwise, creating apps that they're easy, accessible, and intuitive. So that would be, I think, one of the other big challenges is just like there's some great tech out there, but we've got to put it, like, do the work to put it in the hands of the people who need to use it.
Abhi, do you have anything to add?
No, I have nothing to add. It's fascinating to hear what they said, because this is what I hear week after week from scientists and conservation technologists around the world. Yeah.
All right. With that said, so we are going to move on then to what are some of the most important ethical questions right now in conservation tech, such as surveillance or data privacy. How are conservation technology companies handling those ethical considerations, and what should journalists be asking?
I can go first. So I just want to link to this Mongabay story we did 2 months back. Shreya Dasgupta did the story. It's about how technology, I think camera traps and even audio recorders that were set up in a community in India was being used for human surveillance, basically, and was capturing images and audio of the people in the community. And I'm sure that's happening in a lot of other places as well. But that story sort of ended with how researchers and scientists could think of technology while they're deploying it in the field. And I'm deriving everything that I'm saying from that story. But as journalists, we could also think of it like that. So rather than focusing a story on just a study or just one interview from someone who developed the tech, let's try to get voices from the local community as well. So first question is, Shah and Meredith pointed out earlier, like, is the tech needed? Was there consent? Were they informed about, was there transparency basically about what the tech is and how it functions, and the possibility of it capturing their images and their data as well? So these are all questions that we as journalists could and should start thinking about. It's not always easy because, as we mentioned earlier, these are often remote locations. We're not always there, but there are ways to work around that and get answers to that questions rather than making the story one-dimensional, I think. Yeah.
I think surveillance technology is kind of a scary area that we do a lot of thinking around when we think about social safeguarding, and thinking about who knows the data is being collected on them, who has access to that data, can this data be used to monitor or discriminate against particular groups of people? I think the story that you mentioned, Abhi, is such a sobering realization on the unintended consequences of using technology. But the sort of like flip side of that, I went to an absolutely brilliant talk last week by a woman deploying acoustic monitors in a device, and she was really stressing about, and I think a lot more coverage should go into participatory design and how you can really get more out of your study, ask better questions, collect better data if you involve the people in these local areas, not just telling them what's happening, but really bringing them into part of the process and helping them design a study in a way that makes them feel safe, be safe, and then ask questions that they're interested in answering.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so important. We have a project that we do in the Shah Fauna Reserve in Cameroon that we've been working on for a number of years, and we deployed a bunch of technology out into the field. And this year, once all the technology was deployed, we held a series of meetings with local villagers, folks just in the area, describing to them what the technology, why we wanted to put it there, and really kind of speaking to the folks in the area in a way that I think that they felt like they weren't really spoke to before. Like, and the overwhelming support and just kind of thanks that we got as a result of doing that, I think is really important. A lot of times people put, conservation technologies out in the field and they don't even think about the people that live in these areas or, like how that impacts them. And, in the worst cases that results in like people destroying camera traps or, anger in those sorts of areas. But I think even in the best cases, if you don't talk to them, they still feel like, who are these outsiders? Why are they doing this stuff in my backyard? It's not the right way to go about it. So I think that's so important. I think in, making the folks that live in that area as part of those solutions and building them into the whole thing from the very start is critical. I think, we heard from both the other panelists about surveillance technologies. I think this is a big thing. There's been a lot of great research, I would say, in the last, since maybe like 2018 until now, that's focused around like, what does it mean for surveillance sort of conservation technologies and capturing this data, and how do you deal with people? One area of conservation technology is associated with more of like anti-poaching and enforcement, and that tech tends to be military adjacent, and that has its own ethical issues associated with it. And how do you deal with those sorts of things? So I think it's important to have these sort of discussions out, openly and outright. And I think another huge area that people maybe don't talk about as much as they need to is data ownership and access. I think there's huge ethical issues around that. The work that we do with FieldKit is a nonprofit. And I think we have a very forward-thinking approach to how we deal with data privacy and ownership. We don't own anything. Like, we would never sell it or use it for anything else. Like, we're just literally building this tool for other people to be able to do that, and the data is entirely theirs. And we need to think about this, because a lot of maybe like those free tools that are out there, they don't treat the data like that, right? And they might be selling it or using it for other sorts of things. And unless that's very explicitly stated, I think we need to kind of make sure that that's the case, so that people aren't being exploited for using these sorts of tools.
I had a great conversation actually just a few hours ago this morning about data collected on Indigenous lands. And we'd been pushing for the data to be released to open access databases, because open science benefits everyone. And it was a really sobering, like, I learned a lot in this conversation about fair data practices. There is this issue of data sovereignty. Sometimes people do need to retain access to their data for various reasons, including their own safety or Indigenous rights, and getting a sense on how thoughts around data sharing practices and the guidelines that are put in place to protect people and their rights are constantly evolving has been a really interesting area to follow recently. Can I add one more thing in addition to sort of data monitoring?
For sure.
And
yeah, absolutely.
And maybe this isn't ethics, maybe it's a sort of ethics adjacent. But I did want to flag as well that conservation technology can be wasteful and consumptive. Shah was talking about all the batteries you have to go through in a camera trap grid. Our computer chips are built with rare earth elements. There's and Shah, maybe more about this working in the hardware side. The amount of power that goes into training an AI is something I think about. But putting in that thought ahead of time as well, when you're thinking about whether to use tech, is the impact you're having using the tech worse in other maybe non-transparent ways than the benefit you'll get from deploying it in the field?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a huge thing, and really, it's such a trade-off to think about the importance of measuring these things and understanding these things from a biodiversity standpoint, environmental protection, and all these sorts of different areas. I think traditionally, people have dealt with technology as, once it gets into the hands of the folks who are using it. It's no longer my problem, and whatever they do with it, they do with it, and that's what leads to things being in landfills. With FieldKit, we're thinking a lot about how do we be much more kind of progressive in how we think about end of life of these units. Can we bring them back, pull things off of them, make sure that things are recycled in the way that they need to be recycled, so they don't just end up in landfills in parts of the world. And so I think there's a lot of thought to be put around that. And one of the important conversations to have when you're building a new piece of technology is like, what does the life cycle of that technology look like, right? How long is that thing going to be useful? When it's no longer, how do you maintain it? That's a huge thing. Like, is it easily maintained locally, or is this something that can only be maintained in, shipped back to Silicon Valley for X, Y, and Z, right? There's also considerations about like how that thing, what happens to it at the end of life of that technology. And one important thing too is like, how do you make sure that those technologies fail in a way that isn't catastrophic? Can it fail gracefully? Can it do something that's not, we're not even talking about the data here, but we're talking about the impact to the environment. What would be the impact to the environment of that technology? All this stuff should be thought about as these things are being developed and put out in the field.
These are all good thoughts. I do want to move to the next question, though. So, wildlabs.net, which is a really great resource for anyone who is looking to cover conservation technology. But they said in their most recent report, I believe, on the state of conservation technology, that machine learning, eDNA, and networked sensors had the biggest potential to advance conservation. Do you have anything to add on to that? Can you elaborate on that? What do you think journalists should be looking at when examining these three pieces of tech in the years to come?
I mean, I think I mentioned those three technologies in my earlier bit when I was talking about things I'm excited about. I would say, from a high level, when they say network sensors, that basically means like environmental sensors or GPS tags that can, are smaller pieces of hardware that we can deploy places and gather data about how things are changing or the current state of those sorts of things. The machine learning and AI stuff is typically done in regards to, at least right now, in regards to kind of more heavy data when it comes to the user perspective, analyzing camera trap imagery, acoustic recordings of a soundscape, finding different species in that sort of thing. And then the eDNA work. So eDNA is environmental DNA. So that's really looking at like, how can you take a water sample, or even now they're doing air samples, and find pieces of certain DNA from different animals, and can use that data to understand what is out there, and not only like presence, absence, but folks are even thinking about abundance. So the difference between those is presence, absence is it there or is it not there? Abundance is like how much of it is there. This eDNA stuff is very early in the research, so like people are still trying to figure things out around there. It's not you sometimes see people treating it as like this kind of golden solution, and it's not quite there yet. It's still very research heavy. The AI stuff, I think Meredith probably has a lot to say. There are solutions there that work quite well with that. And then the sensors, there's a lot of work to be done there, but also the limitations around batteries and communications, as I said, there is a big part of it, of keeping us from doing what we would really like to do in that space.
Can I just flag something in the way you phrased this question that I think is really interesting, Mike? If you look at the report, these three technologies are technologies that people think have the potential to advance conservation if current problems are addressed. So there are other technologies in the report that people think like tomorrow are going to have a huge impact. And these are ones, just if we're reporting on these technologies, just thinking again about the hype cycle, us as practitioners, we think these tools are great. We think that they're pretty cool. We can see they're novel. We can see the potential in them based on the commercial applications. But as Shah's kind of been highlighting here, there's issues with applying them at the moment. So just to be cautious of, are we sliding down that peak of inflated expectations into the trough of disillusionment? Like when we're talking about these technologies, just be quite conscious of the fact that we think these are going to be the next big thing, but it's only if we can overcome some of these existing issues with the tech. That being said, I am really excited about these kinds of technologies for some of the reasons mentioned. With AI, I think some of the places that we're going with this is the algorithms are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And that gives us the opportunity to embed them into the devices that we put in the field. So instead of going out and spending 6 months collecting data and then currying the data, transporting the data to some university and then processing the data, and it's like a year later you have data, we now have these small, tiny embedded AIs coupled with network sensors. You can get an AI running on the data as it comes in, and it pings you a message that, there's a lion with a snare on it in this part of the Serengeti, and you can go out and you can start having impact in real time. So smaller, clever AI, enhanced connectivity. And again, as I've mentioned a couple of times before, just this growing recognition that these softwares need to be wrapped and packaged in ways that make them usable for us conservation people. So with AI, there's some really great GUIs and training platforms now where you can build an AI without having to deal with the code directly, which is putting AI and the ability to use this really cool tool in the hands of a lot of different people.
Great. Thank you very much, Meredith. Really quick, just to clarify, because Meredith brought up a really great point, I'm referencing a survey. So, Meredith pointed out that these are actually respondents that responded to a survey about conservation technology, to be clear. So my apologies for not stating that at first. That said, the second part of this that I wanted to ask about, also on that survey from Wild Labs, was one of the biggest reasons that respondents felt optimistic about the state of conservation technology was the accessibility of conservation technology. So I was curious to hear the panelists' thoughts on that one. But also the cost of the technology was listed as one of the biggest barriers to the adoption to it. So Meredith and Shah, I'm obviously curious to hear your thoughts about that. And Abhi, of course, would like your opinion on that as well.
Okay, just to go off from where Meredith ended, I think with eDNA, I don't know if it's the inflated expectations, but we're seeing, and what Shah said as well, the way it's measured, abundance, for instance, is becoming something that people are looking into, and how it's being gathered is also how eDNA samples are being collected. Meredith and I, earlier this year in Singapore, saw a lot of innovative ways in which eDNA samples were being collected, which, again, it's not, from what we saw there, for instance, it's not something everyone could do. A lot of it was expensive. But with regard to eDNA, I'm coming back to eDNA again, I recently did a story about how now leaf swabbing is being used. Again, not sure if this is part of that inflated expectation here, but swabbing leaves is becoming a way to collect DNA samples in a cheap, effective manner. So there are things happening there, and we should keep monitoring it as journalists, of course, but with some form of skepticism as well. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Abhi. And sorry for jumping on your answer there. So, and now going to accessibility concerns.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the things that I've heard the most, just like for some context, like the way that Conservify has always operated is that we built ourselves as a technology development lab, as the tool makers, right? So every project that we would work on would be a partnership with an NGO or, a field scientist or whatever, like people in university, like people who actually had a conservation project that they were working in some place of the world, and we would develop a new technology for it. One of the main principles behind all of my research and kind of the way that I've been doing things is that all the technology we develop is open source. The reason why I do that is because accessibility has always been somewhat limited by the technology providers that are out there and the cost, right? Those two things are largely kind of an issue when you have a technology that's needed and there's not 15 million people who are going to be using that technology. And so like traditionally conservation technologies like maybe emerged from the university environment, or they came out of some proprietary company that's been building sensors for a long time. Those sorts of mechanisms don't lend themselves to creating something that is easily used in the global south and like all this sort of stuff, right? So what we try and do with making things open source is like, how do we build and design something and then put all that information about, the hardware designs and the codes and all code and all that stuff online so other people can replicate it? Like, how can you use open source as a mechanism to increase accessibility? I think that's an important thing that I very much deeply believe in. But like some of the other things I've mentioned during this call that I think are important to accessibility is usability, and Meredith talked about this as well. Like, how do you make something work not only for kind of a professor at Yale, but also a grade school student in Botswana, right? Like, how can you create a tool that has no real strong significant barriers to usability in the field? If you do that, then anyone can use it, and you're more likely to get good data out of that sort of thing. Another important thing in terms of accessibility is like maintenance. What happens when that thing breaks? How do you replace parts on it? Is there enough information online for people to figure things out? Documentation about how to use that tool. All that stuff is important around maintainability and making sure that tool has a long life of good service out in the field, getting you the information that you need to do. And I think the last thing that's important for accessibility, as we've mentioned earlier, is like, what happens to the tech when it's no longer useful? Like, where does that go? I think you can go in like, national parks and protected areas all over the world and find in some back room or some container somewhere, there's a bunch of broken drones and other tech that maybe they couldn't get to work correctly, or like it just broke over time. And that stuff's just sitting there, wasting space, maybe even leaking fluids and doing bad stuff into those sorts of areas. So I think it's really important in terms of like getting the tools in the hands of the most people out there, that we think about like, what does it look like at the end of life of this technology?
We can't celebrate people like you, Shah, enough in the conservation space. The people who are out there crafting these tools for us, even though we do have very limited applications for them, and thinking through these processes. And I just want to give one big shout out to sort of the hobbyist maker hacker communities. There's so much now that is designable, accessible, and cheap, like thinking about Raspberry Pis, or your single board microcontrollers or computers, your 3D printers, these really cheap drones that we have these days. Like, there's a lot that we can take as a substrate to build on to create the tools that we need to collect the data we need, because of really fun innovation that's happening in these external communities as well. It makes I've used a lot of tools kind of hacked together from bits and pieces from, I guess Radio Shack doesn't exist anymore. What's today's Radio Shack? And like those also have impact in conservation too.
Abhi, did you have anything to add to that one?
No, nothing more than what Meredith and Shah said.
We should really start our audience Q&A soon. So we had a couple more questions and I just want to get to at least one of those really quick. And I think it's worth talking about. How do we improve relationships between scientists and sources and the journalists that communicate with them. Experts, what are some ways in which you think journalists can improve their communication with you? And then Abhi, what are some ways that in which you think conservation technologists and scientists can improve their relationship and communication with journalists?
Just a really quick shout out for what Abhi has done, which I think is brilliant. Like, you come out to the field and watch us in action, and you've sweated with us and struggled with us. And, I think that must, I'm assuming that adds a valuable perspective to the struggles that we face. And also, I hope, showcases the people who try really, really hard to make this happen. So thank you, Abhi, for actually taking the time to come out and be with us on the ground. I think that's the best relationships I've had, the best communication, the best, like, heart and soul of how we use conservation technology that I've been able to convey isn't by chatting with someone over Zoom, but by putting up a camera trap with them and, opening up a battery pack and it's full of ants, and it's, like that, those like experiences, like being able to bring you into our world is really key for me. So thank you.
Yeah, I echo that. I think that's really important. We conservation technologists are all passionate about what we do, right? We don't do it for the money. And building tech and putting it into like some of the most environmentally difficult places in the world leads to a ton of failure, right? Like there's not a lot of upsides other than the fact that we deeply believe that we can do this better and that we want to help the global issues around conservation and environmental protection. And so, yeah, I think those relationships are really important. And I think talking, the stories around the storytelling around the people using those tools, not only the developers, but the folks using those tools, how those tools are making a difference, all that sort of stuff deeply matters. And I think it's important, and it gets past a lot of the, hype cycle stuff, or talking about Web3 for conservation or NFTs and things that are like, feel like more distractions, as opposed to like what's happening on the ground and like, what are some real, honest success cases that we could talk about here in this space. I think that's important.
And yeah, from my perspective, I completely agree with Meredith and Shah, where sweating it out, experiencing it, and living it with people on the field is the way to go about it. But often at times we are not able to do it every time. So I think the best way to also communicate and maintain that relation, like with any beat in journalism, is to just stay in touch, just call them up, message them, not just for your story, but just to understand what's happening, what they're working on, and get their perspective on how something else is happening. It shouldn't just be about what they're working on, but get their perspective on something completely different, even if it's not for a quote for a story. Just, I think that's part of the source building in journalism, and I think that's how you should continue to do it here as well.
I think like one final thought from me is I struggle to read conservation reporting because it's usually very sad. And something like the reason I do conservation tech is because I do see so much hope in this field, and it's exciting and dynamic, and we're always learning and we're always evolving. And stories that celebrate the conservation optimism, as well as keeping us all up to date on the crises we're undergoing, I think are so valuable for people, keeping people going in this field and in this space.
All right, panel, thank you so much. That concludes the main panel discussion, and now we're going to move on to your questions, audience. And we've got a couple, and we'll likely get through them. I will probably put a stop at this at around like an hour 20 in. So if you do have any questions, just go ahead and drop them in the chat right now. But I'm going to start with the first one that I thought I wanted to highlight here. This one is from Modi. Technology often increases safety in the field. Staying connected. What is your favorite technology to increase safety in remote areas?
Radios. Oh my goodness. Yeah, no, the ability to stay connected with field teams and rangers and patrols and people going out there in the field is so key. This ability to stay in touch in real time. And I wanted to flag too that something as simple as a radio isn't necessarily straightforward to deploy in the field either. I know we heard a really great talk last year at a tech summit from a gentleman who works in Mozambique, and he runs a ranger patrol, and he can't stay in touch with them because every single radio tower he puts up gets struck by lightning. And they can't ground the radio towers because they're sitting on these rocky inselbergs and they can't ground them to the soil. So the towers just keep getting destroyed and there's no connectivity and there's no radios. And that's such a simple tool. And without that tool, it's completely, it grinds their conservation operations to a halt. So just like we can't underestimate the power of something, we have Bluetooth and we have LoRa and we have Starlink, we have Elon Musk, I don't know, we have all of these connectivity tools, which are amazing, but we also have something as simple as a radio. And without those radios, nothing does get done.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a good point. I mean, I think a lot of folks nowadays, they don't really realize what it means to be in an area with no communications, just because it's become so prevalent nowadays, and we're just all used to being able to, even if we have real bad service, we could still maybe make a phone call or something. But so much of this work happens in deep wilderness sort of environments where there's not a lot of that stuff. So yeah, we always bring around these little inReaches and stuff when we're doing work out in the field. But again, this is not a cheap option for folks when they're out there. So yeah, I think that's an important thing to do. Is some sort of communications mechanism is very helpful.
Sorry, my mic was muted. Got a good question from Georgina Seal here. In the U.S., we often hear about AI and tech taking over jobs, particularly for unskilled labor. How does conservation technology contribute to or take away from employment in developing countries?
Yeah, I think, just to throw back to one thing I mentioned before in terms of how do we pull on local knowledge of systems and the skills that actual humans have versus deploying a tech tool that collects similar data and comes with different challenges. I think it's something that people are recognizing more and more, the importance of thinking through these processes beforehand. I'm really heartened to see it feels like a huge upsurge in participatory approaches to data collection and the recognition that there's different ways of knowing, that there's different information we can draw on for science and conservation. So I think that just speaking about tech data collection, data environmental monitoring tools, it is something that's getting more and more thought these days, and when we're deciding how to monitor different systems.
Yeah, I would maybe also add, I think that AI taking away opportunities, or even tech taking away opportunities when it comes to conservation technology, we're much further away from that than I would say typical office jobs and things like that. There's still a huge amount of folks, boots on the ground, people out there gathering the data, doing that sort of work. And in every project that I've worked on, we've actually trained local folks in use of the technologies, maintenance of the technologies, worked with local universities on how do you, since these things are open source, how do you take these open source solutions and maybe create your own version of them? So in a small way, I'm always working to increase the capacity of those areas in terms of technology, increase the technology capacity. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to be able to do that. But I worry less about the jobs that are going to be taken away, because it's still conservation in the real world is still very kind of boots on the ground dependent. I mean, people need to be out there to do these sorts of things. We're not at a point where little robots can drive around rainforests and tell us what's going on inside of those. And we're very, very far away from that.
All right, I'm going to move on to the next question we have here from Jake. Meredith, you talked about this a bit earlier, but in terms of conservation tech accessibility, can you speak some more to how you think web-based tools can do a better job of engaging with folks in areas with connectivity challenges?
Oh, I might like a little, can I get resolution on that question? I have a lot to say about web-based tools and how they can do a great job of engaging people in conservation. My background is online citizen science, where we relied on volunteers from around the world to help us in the days before AI to help us process camera trap data. And we used that platform as a way to connect the public with real researchers, to bring them into the field, to take them on their, like we called it an armchair safari, to give them this perspective, this on the ground perspective of wildlife conservation in Africa that they wouldn't otherwise have. But I'm curious about this part of the question about engaging folks in areas with connectivity challenges. I'm not entirely sure how to address that. Shah, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I think there are real issues here. The problem is that so many of these tools that we use on a daily basis have been built in a way that just requires access of the internet to do that. And that really pushes us to these areas where we're using simpler things or allowing us to kind of leverage other stuff to be able to do those sorts of tasks. I mean, one thing that is even the work that we do sometimes is at these research stations that maybe we have internet, but it's like a trickle of internet coming in. And once you actually use your computer or like you're trying to do work in these areas, you realize how much of the tools we use on a daily basis on our computers just absolutely become junk if they don't have access to like good access to the internet. So I think it's really important to think through that. And as we, as developers of conservation technologies, as we understand what it is that people actually need when it's out there, it's important that this like ability for use in areas where communications isn't good is like a key requirement in the design process. It's also like this also plays into a fact when it comes into understanding what the data is after the fact. So it's not only in collection of the data or like management of the data, but it's also like analyzing that data. So much of what we do nowadays just requires cloud and strong internet connections that I think it's important that we look at the tools and highlight the tools that don't need that. And I don't have any great examples that jump out of, I think it's very dependent on what you're trying to do. And so we usually have to do a bit of research around that depending on what it is that we're doing in the field.
Oh, you're entirely right. I was thinking about that from the wrong perspective, but that's been a huge struggle with us using AI tools that get developed because many of them run in the cloud. And when you're in the middle of Tanzania, uploading 5 terabytes of data to the cloud is not going to happen. And that makes it a bit difficult.
So Jake is specifying here. He says, my specific interest is in remote sensing and particularly satellite data. The tool I work with uses imagery streamed from commercial data vendors, and I wonder about ways that we can plug into more spaces where that can be the barrier.
Ooh, that's such a good thought. I don't work a lot with satellite data. We do have a number of experts at my NGO who do, but this isn't an area I'm particularly familiar about how this data gets acquired and shared. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I would also add, like, typically we have checklists that we do before we go into the field of like all the things we need to pay attention to or make sure that we do. And one of it is kind of downloading any sort of satellite data that might be relevant and maps and all that stuff to the devices themselves, because so many times we've gone out to the field and realized we don't have access to that, or like the app has offloaded all that data because it's expecting to be connected to the cloud, and we get kind of screwed by these situations. And so it's really something that, as I said, you have to put a lot of upfront thought into it to make sure that you're ready for once you're out in the field. Also, like, not everything has to actually be done out in the field. Like, there is stuff that can be done in places where you have good internet, and that if you need some, for satellite data, if you need some ground truthing to be done using different sorts of tools, that can just be integrated with that satellite data after the time in the field, the expedition or whatever it is. So I think just planning around that is really kind of how you get around the limitations when it comes to internet and communications.
Well, panel, that's all the time we have for today. So I just want to give a big thank you to our panel for joining and giving such an informative and engaging discussion. And also, audience, you were great. You gave a lot of great questions here, and there were a couple that we didn't get to. I'm so sorry. So thank you so much for participating in this webinar series, which we hope that you're continuing to enjoy. On that note, if you did register for this webinar, you'll be receiving a publication notice after we edit this and upload it to YouTube. It will be available on demand after we're done right now, but you'll get a separate email that will contain the fully edited version with the timestamps and a brief survey that we would like you to fill out. Again, if you have a story idea that you want to pitch to Mongabay, go to our opportunities page at mongabay.org, scroll down the page and find the special reporting project that most closely fits your story idea and send us your pitch. And then please do sign up for our occasional email newsletter, which shares new paid reporting opportunities and job openings with us. And you can also subscribe and become a part of our growing webinar newsletter community and get information about our latest offerings there. I do recommend you follow us here on YouTube, but you can also get updates via LinkedIn, Threads, Mastodon, and Blue Sky, where we will also post announcements in advance of each of these webinars. So thank you again to our panel for joining, and we'll see you all at the next one. Bye, everybody.